Welcome again. The thought of the day is this: why Tibetan? Why do we recite sadhanas and other practice texts in Tibetan? And if you've asked that question, some of the reasoning that I've heard, first is that there are blessings in the sounds themselves of the Tibetan, and that will be lost or diluted if it is translated. Second, when someone who speaks English, or whatever your native tongue is, attains realization, then you can do the practice in that language. And thirdly, we do it in Tibetan out of respect for the Tibetan culture. Now, perhaps it is important to distinguish between mantras and the rest of the text in a sadhana. So let's leave mantras out for now. We'll come back to it in a bit. So, mantras aside, let's look at each of the reasons for reciting the text in Tibetan. So first, blessings being lost or diluted. Now, what blessings are exactly is another topic that bears some scrutiny as well, but let's leave that for another video. We know that these texts were originally in Sanskrit and then translated into Tibetan back when Buddhism first came to Tibet. So I would think if the blessings are that tenuous, then they have already been lost. I really think that any blessing related to the practice would have a power beyond the relative vowel-consonant structure of any particular language. I have a hard time believing that blessings from an enlightened mind are piggybacking on specific words. I find that notion small and limiting, and as such pretty unconvincing, given the expansive nature of what the blessings and the texts are about. Next is that we have to wait till someone who speaks English, French, and Nuktuk becomes enlightened before we can recite the liturgy in that language. Again, historically speaking, the Tibetan translators were not necessarily highly realized beings when they translated, although they were often guided by realized Indian masters. In the same way, English translations are done by regular translators and guided by Tibetan masters. So again, I think that argument doesn't have a lot of merit. And finally, we have that to recite it in Tibetan is done out of respect for Tibetan culture. I personally don't see forcing non-native speakers to recite Tibetan words as really showing any meaningful respect for Tibetan culture. If you forced everyone to learn Tibetan, perhaps, but I don't think that's very realistic, and it just creates barriers to helping all sentient beings, which includes peoples of other cultures and languages. Who knows, perhaps someday peoples of other planets and spatial dimensions as well. But I digress. So now let's talk about mantras. Mantras tend to be a combination of seed syllables and regular words. Seed syllables have no real translation, and they have symbolic meanings that vary depending on context. My understanding is that they're not even part of the actual Sanskrit language. They happen to be expressed in Sanskrit written form, but they were an idea that came up later. So fine, let's leave those as is. What about the regular words? So, Om Mani Padme Hum translates to Om, jewel in the lotus, Hum. However, the symbolism behind the words jewel and lotus goes quite deep, and I encourage you to look into it on your own time. And then the combination of the two creates even more nuances and suggestive symbolism. So the question is, would the English translation Om, jewel in the lotus, Hum be as effective as a mantra? Now, I know for me personally, it doesn't resonate as well, but that may be biased based on repeated exposure at a young age to the Sanskrit and Tibetan versions. Now, I'm reminded of a time when I went to an art gallery and there was a work by an artist, his name is Edward Ruscha, R-U-S-C-H-A, and it took up an entire, four panels, entire room. All four walls had this primitive drawing, it's like charcoal, I think, of a mountain range, and the words, Muhammad came to the mountain came to Muhammad. Muhammad came to the mountain came to Muhammad, repeated over and over and over again, all across the walls. And I remember when I walked into there and read that and saw that, that resonated. It felt like a mantra. There was no conceptual or logical reasoning. It just spoke to something deep and about something deep. And that was in English. So I think we probably could find English, French, and Nuktuk translations that could resonate. But really, mantras are short for the most part, and I do find they resonate even without their translated meanings. Now, mantras aside, I do think we could be reciting the rest of the text in our mother tongues. The only issue I find is that in English, and I can't speak for other languages here, often the Tibetan is translated in a very wordy, descriptive way, like prose rather than poetry. And I think we lose something with this kind of translation. The ambiguity and resonance needs to be retained. So here's a sample passage from a text I have where for some reason they provided a direct, as it is, poetic translation along with the more usual prose-like translation. So first the prose version. May I and all beings from now on and in all successive lifetimes not be separated from the Supreme Glorious Lama. Having experienced the taste of the nectar of the unsurpassed Dharma, may we all as one group manifest Buddhahood. Now the more direct translation. May I and all in our future lives never part from splendid best Lama. Tasting unsurpassed nectar, may we gathered as one become real Buddhas. The first version to me is something you read. The second version is something you recite. I know the splendid best Lama is a bit awkward. Perhaps it could be simplified, or maybe we just trust it and leave it as is. Now, I'm not a translator, and I do not mean to be an armchair translator, but I am a consumer of the translations, and I do prefer the second translation, and in general, the idea of creating more poetic translations, and leave the prose for commentaries on the translations, which historically is exactly what the Tibetans did with the original root Sanskrit texts that were translated into Tibetan. They translated them verbatim, retaining as much of the poetic language as possible, and then subsequent masters would write commentaries about those root texts, explaining and elaborating on the deep meaning behind the symbolism in the words. Now, it's my understanding that part of the challenge translating from the Tibetan is that there are some words that have no simple English equivalent. The Tibetans apparently ran into the same issue translating from Sanskrit, and in certain cases they kept the original Sanskrit word, although they would change the sound to accommodate Tibetan speakers. For example, the word Vajra in mantra is often recited as Benzra by Tibetans. It's not a Tibetan word, it's just the Sanskrit word spelt in a way or pronounced in a way that works for Tibetan speakers. Interestingly, outside of the mantra context, Vajra is translated into the Tibetan word Dorje, which means something like king of stones, implying diamond, which was one of the original meanings of the Sanskrit word. And in some cases, the Tibetans actually created new words or used existing words but imbued them with more nuanced meaning. So, for example, Rigpa was an existing Tibetan word, meaning to know. But now, within the context of a Buddhist text or teaching, it now meant primordial awareness. And at times, perhaps it meant both. So, over time, our modern translators may have to start using similar techniques, and probably already are. Now, there are some cases where translating to English may be more problematic. For example, anything that is sung with a melody, like Chod practice, converting that to English while preserving the melody could be quite challenging, if not impossible. A better approach would be to have a Chod master carefully work with an English, French, and Uktuk songwriter to come up with a completely different yet resonant melody for the translation. So I guess I don't see any really good reason why we need to recite in Tibetan. I suspect if and when we get more poetic translations, we might see a natural shift to recitation in our native tongues. And of course, eventually an English, French, and Uktuk speaker will attain realization or discover and reveal a terma in their native language, and then we'll have to decide how it should be best translated into Tibetan. Now, having said all that, most sanghas I've been involved with usually recite some portion of the practices in English and some in Tibetan, and the mantras either in Tibetan or the original Sanskrit. Now, I've been encouraged to do certain practices or sections in Tibetan, but usually with the caveat that, hey, if you really need to do it in English, of course, go ahead. which I think is good advice, as ultimately you want to make the practice your own and figure out what works best for you. At least that's my opinion. So I just wanted to explore some of the justifications I've overheard, and usually it was from fellow students rather than from the teachers themselves. Well, that's the thought for the day. Hope you found it fun to think about. All the best, and remember, Muhammad came to the mountain, the mountain came to Muhammad, Muhammad came to the mountain, the mountain came to Muhammad, Muhammad came to the mountain, the mountain came to Muhammad, 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 the mountain came to Muhammad.